Hello, everyone out there. Welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Ian Kerr, who is going to be leading a workshop today called Wandering into the Multispecies Commons, a walking workshop on novel urban ecosystem features. And Ian is coming to us from New Jersey, and he is representing SPURSE, a creative design consultancy that focuses on social, ecological, and ethical transformation. Hello, everyone out there. Welcome. It is my pleasure to... Getting some feedback over here. Sorry about that. But SPURSE is, Ian will tell you a little bit more about SPURSE, but they're doing some incredible work that is really empowering communities through ecological stewardship and community fostering. So Ian, with that, I'll let you take it away.
Hey, thanks, Caitlin. It's great to be participating in this. So will we be able to see people who are joining us? Just quick questions.
We will not. I'll see them in YouTube, and okay. I'll be sort of the mediator between. So if anyone, actually, I'll just mention this really briefly too. If anyone has any questions, please post them in the chat in the live stream. And then I will be the facilitator of those questions and the connection, basically.
Okay, great. Hey, so I'm Ian Kerr. As Caitlin was saying, I'm part of SPURSE.
Please.
And today we're trying to do a simple workshop / discussion around rethinking our urban ecosystems, really rethinking where we live and how we entangle with it and how we think of it on a big scale. So I wanted to start by being indoors, where I think when we think of nature and we think of environments and we think of ecosystems, we usually imagine places far from humans, where there are no humans. You know, the glaciers and the Yosemites and the Patagonias and what have you. And we imagine maybe there's pockets of nature and pockets of the environment around us in cities, but that we're removed from it and we're distinct and separate. And this is part of the discussion I want to have. So I want to take a moment while you're inside, what we would call inside, to just physically pay attention to it for a minute as an ecosystem, as a diverse ecosystem. So when we breathe in, we're breathing in, millions of critters. There's thousands of different species in the air around us, and our interior urban ecosystems have the same biodiversity as our exterior urban ecosystems, and they're equally important. So I think wherever you are, just let's take a minute and, physically sense that diversity. It's one that's hard to see. So breathing and smelling, touching things, noticing where other creatures are, what's happening, I think really matters. The second important thing, I think, to ground ourselves is to understand that our bodies are also ecosystems. We're not an individual. We're not a discrete species entity, the Homo sapien. Our skin is a vast, dynamic ecosystem of thousands of different species and billions of examples of them. And our skin folds inside ourselves. It continues down our throats and into our stomachs, our small and large intestine, and then goes back out our ass, and it becomes skin again. And that space is even a vaster, richer ecosystem. But this is all an exteriority that's become an interiority. So it's, this beautiful world of ecology. And when we think about connecting ourselves to our immediate environment, that's not somewhere else, and that nature's not somewhere else. That begins with our body, and our body and the richness of its biodiversity is shaped by how we entangle with the immediate world around us. Where we walk, what we step on, our hygiene practices, what we eat. There's connections between immune responses and various other conditions to how much children play in dirt and dust and all of that. So there's an immediate connection. So I think to feel that is really important, and to bring that with us as we go outside. So I can't see any of you. I hope you're grounding yourself in this kind of ecosystemic self, environmental self, in an environment. And we're slowly letting go of this idea that there's a nature that is separate from us, some type of pure wilderness. And we're seeing that we are ecologically situated, ecologically bound, incredibly diverse space. And it might look like the world around me or the world around you, but that's the environment too. This is a really rich environment, deeply connected environment. So I'd like to walk with you outside and sit, in the grass outside our house and talk, and hopefully you can join me by walking outside. And, if your outside is any number of things, that's fine. If there is no possibility, if there's possibility of opening a window, sitting by a window, something like that would be great. So let's head outside. It's nice where I am. It's now raining slightly, so I might have to duck under our porch. We're on a street here. Let's sit on the ground directly, so we kind of sense and feel that part of our world. So I want to start by talking about urban plants, because urban plants are super interesting. And if you're outside, and if you can, I would just grab something that's around you, any plant. If you can recognize the plant and you understand it's edible. I've got plantain. It's already being eaten by other critters. And I'd love for you guys just to taste your environment. Its bitterness, whatever its qualities are. I've also got some dandelion. I dug up some earlier, these bigger examples. If you, I'd recommended having a foraging guide as we do this. It's a really good thing to own. Some people use apps. That's also great. What I think is important about starting by eating things directly in your environment is that we're starting not by being separate and thinking of our environment abstractly, but conjoining with it in a really immediate, visceral manner. So whatever's happened to our environment, whatever has gone into the soil and into the plant is now going into us. And so there's really no separation in that sense. We're participating in the immediacy of our environment. And I think this is both an important aesthetic position to start in, like to imagine a mode of being alive that's full and beautiful that begins under your feet. It doesn't begin with images and the imaginary being elsewhere. The second part is an ethical part where, we are really intra-dependent on our environment. And I think we can easily forget that and develop systems to avoid that truth, where if we're eating plants that come from elsewhere that we've protected and made environmentally pure, our organic lettuce coming from a rainforest and somewhere in Amazonia that they've clear cut so it can be organic, that guarantees some kind of purity, but what does that mean for the places we actually live and inhabit? And I think that's a profound ethical question. And I think this also gets to a cosmological question, of what does it mean to be alive? How do we want to see ourselves connected to things? What's the status of these things? What's their history and their agency? So it turns out I grabbed just growing on the corner here is like a foxtail grass. The foxtail is related, if we pull apart its little seed pod. You often see these, they're very beautiful, right? This is related to millet, one of the first grains that we supposedly cultivated. So that's a really interesting question, and this has also interested us really deeply. Were we the cultivators, or did the grains in some sense cultivate us? And it turns out now that there's a lot of research that, and I can post this in the chat as we go on, but that species were active agents in cultivating us to distribute their seed. And so the sources of agriculture are much more complicated than just saying it's human domination of something. So this is an interesting creature that's been shaping us, and we've been shaping it for something like 70, 80, 100,000 years or longer. And it co-shaped species before us that shaped it. So I think that's one important part of the framework we want to have as we eat things. They're shaping us. They're working with our gut and our bodies. They're co-evolving qualities. So like plantain is something that's been with us since metal because it's really great at clotting wounds. So it's often just chewed up and put on wounds. So the next thing I want to say is we start to see species as a type of partner and a way to be in our environment that's producing interdependency is to understand that urban ecosystems are not failed states of some previous ecosystem, which is, I think, the standard way we think of cities. We think like, well, there might be a little remnant of what was there before, and then humans came in, dominated and destroyed nature, and there's no more nature except for in these small, sparse little nooks and crannies and parks that need to be preserved, and perhaps some people are growing a native plant here and there. But this sort of thinking of urban ecosystems as failed states turns out to be environmentally entirely wrong. Urban ecosystems are thriving and viable. And the important, I think, mindset change to make is to see the entirety of an urban space as an ecosystem. The inside of your house, the streets, the roads, the parks, the gardens, all of these are a singular ecosystem. It's not just the nature park in the city that's where it's an urban ecosystem, the entirety. And it's called a novel ecosystem, which is to say it's an entirely new type of ecosystem that emerged with cities that needs to be looked at in its own way. And that isn't the same way we'd look at an ecosystem in Patagonia or in Amazonia. It needs its own logic and criteria. And this is something I think really important to shift to, because most humans, now something like 70%, live in cities, and we live deeply entangled in these ecosystems, but we don't really know how to understand them. We don't really know how to approach them except by using these old models of thinking of them as failed systems, thinking of natural systems as separate from human systems. And we really don't get a grasp on the entangled nature of it. We don't get a grasp on how rapidly species other than us are colonizing cities and have come with us into cities and shaped them. And we're still always looking back at a cosmology, the cosmology of nature is separate from humans. And it's really not allowing us to get a grasp on the world we're actually in. So I'm talking a lot, and I'd love for people, for any question or thought. Caitlin, if you also have something you want to add as we go along. If people, if you can, add it to the YouTube chat. And I'm going to just grab a couple items from behind me, and then we'll continue. Hey, Caitlin.
Hey. There aren't any questions in the chat, and right now I'm really just enjoying listening to you. So I don't have any questions other than, well, just a comment that I feel a lot more aware. I'm having to stay inside in my own little office ecosystem, which is filled with a lot of plants and some mycelium and a lot of art making materials. So I feel a close relationship to all of those things, but because of Zoom and everything, I can't leave my space.
It's true. It's really interesting, even that, to talk about houseplants and plants people grow inside or on their decks. There was a survey, environmental survey recently done in Berlin, where they try to calculate the biomass of like interior ecosystems in terms of like plants and what have you. And one of the things they found was there's more food being grown. So in a sense, there's more farmland inside people's houses and on their balconies than in the farms that were surrounding Berlin. So, and I think these things really help us change our mindset and our framework, where you see all of these things aren't alien to the world we're in, but they're a critical part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes me think of, I'm not sure I could name the species, but that there's a few species of tropical plants that are going extinct, or that were extinct basically outdoors, but indoors they're some of the most prolific houseplants.
Yeah, so there's a whole movement, I think, especially in urban ecology and the study of urban ecosystems, to think of the urban environment as spaces to preserve, what we would call exotic species. I think LA has a type of parrot that now is nowhere else. Am I right in that?
Yeah, I think so.
And they're what's introduced in the common way we talk of that, but they're not really found anywhere else. And this gets to another, like, I'd say, cosmological thing of like, how do we think native and invasive? And how did we come to have these terms, and why do they persist, and what impact do they have on how we interact with our world? And, so native and invasive are terms that began in England. They're a pre-Darwinian framework that really was about preserving, almost in a political sense, the uniqueness of Britain. But it wasn't, and it still really isn't, a framework that you can really say has a non-arbitrary scientific validity. So it's highly contentious, I guess would be the way to say it, within the environmental sciences. And, part of it's because the traditional way, or the contemporary way we define a native plant, is a plant that got to where it is and is living without human intervention of any kind. And invasive or non-native plant would be one that we helped. But it turns out, like, California is a great example. You can't almost find any so-called native that isn't deeply, deeply entangled with humans, and that the First Nations people of California so powerfully co-shaped the environment that nothing would really fit that criteria. And then the other really interesting part there is that as rapid climate change, again, which you really see in California right now with the fires, species are moving, so what was, say, further south is coming further north. And you find that a lot in New Jersey and the East Coast, that because of climate change, things that were not native to so-called native to a region are now becoming native. And so the concept of native invasive, you could debate it on one hand, historically and politically as problematic, but also just as a pragmatic, on-the-ground reality. It's hindering our ability to understand how we're entangled with the world and how the world's so rapidly changing. And I think the other part is that it doesn't give species much credit as agents. Where in urban ecosystems, so many of the species we see have both radically and rapidly changed, evolved to become urban, and they've also shaped the niches they're in. So they're co-constructing our urban space, and they're evolving to meet it. So you have, I think it's also on the West Coast, there's a type of frog. It might be actually in Portland, Oregon, that's adapted itself entirely to urban, like, pools and ponds that just spring up when it rains. And to do that, it has a different way of dealing with a lot of toxins that are on streets and runoff. And in that way, it's, if you go like 20 miles outside of Portland, the same frog, the same species is not adapted to that. And if you you would lose that kind of unique urban quality it's developed. So I think that's a really important part of shifting our perspective from a native and invasive to a view that starts with what's there and how's it working, what's it doing, which is often called a more functionalist perspective. What's its environmental function? Versus like native invasive is just you check something's passport, and if its passport says non-human, it has a right to be there. And if it says recent, human helped arrival, it should be deported. And I don't think it should be lost in anyone that that's the same way we're approaching people, and that the viewpoints co-evolved, right? So I'd love it. I don't know who's all out there watching, but I'd love to introduce a couple more species that we could eat, and just talk about how we taste things. So I got this lamb's quarter that was also growing right on our street edge here. Lamb's quarter is a really beautiful plant. This is a Eurasian lamb's quarter, so it's coming from sort of Central Asia, and it's actually migrated both ways to America, from east and west. It's the same family, and it has deep roots with like Pangea to the quinoa. So the Inca are growing the same plant as quinoa, and for us it's now a weed. At one time in Europe and through other parts of Asia, it was both eaten and the seeds were used to make like gruels. So it was like a polenta before corn.
There's one question from the audience that might pertain to this, which is, what if the plants are sprayed?
Oh, such a great question. I guess there's like a couple answers to that. The first is the cautious answer. Let me, where's my shovel? So I'm sitting in our yard, which, pick something up. Clover. And one way you can really tell if where you're foraging has been sprayed, and which is to say mainly with herbicides, but also with insecticides, is if there's any non-grass leafy things. So modern herbicides are meant to kill all the other leafy things. And they discovered, I can't remember when, herbicides that did that really well. But the one plant to look for that's a great signifier of non-sprayed or not recently sprayed is clover. And clover is great because it's super easy to recognize. This is white clover. It has that white blossom. These are actually, each little bit is its own flower, so it's like a multi-flowered head. What's also really great with clover is clover's symbiotic with a type of bacteria that can transform airborne nitrogen and bring it into the soil. So wherever you see clover, you can see a really good urban multi-species entanglement to make great soil. It's also very important to any number of insects and other pollinators. And it tastes delicious if you're eating the flower head. So the first way to tell, I'd say, if where you eat is okay, is by looking for what's in the ground around it. There's also been a lot of studies, and I think I'd have to find, I know at Berkeley, they did a number of studies looking at LA and San Francisco and like spontaneously growing plants, what we normally call weeds in urban environments. And they had incredibly low levels of toxicity in their leafy matter, the stuff we'd eat, versus say like their roots. So eating lamb's quarter, you're pretty safe. The last answer I'd give is that ethical answer, which might be more controversial, but I think there's a type of moral failure where we imagine we can damage our environment around us, and then we'll just buy food that comes from somewhere else, and we can destroy that rainforest and grow organic and pure things, and then avoid ever having to think about the status of the place we live in. And so I think there's an immediacy that's provoked by foraging in place. Like, why is it okay to spray? Why is it okay to do, such harm? And that this is, again, I think in this moment, it's even more pertinent where, all of this stuff is running downstream. All of it's running in our case, in New Jersey, we live uphill from Newark. Wealth is usually uphill. It's definitely true also in LA, I think. We're closer to the water. And so how toxins move is more impacting people of color, poor people. And it's, and so I think there's a real direct need to start where we actually are, and not imagine that we can continue this idea of making pure places elsewhere, whether it's like Yosemite or an organic farm, but that it has to ethically and cosmologically start under our feet. So that would be like how I'd answer that. And so I think it's important to forage even if you're not sure, at the same time as you're trying to figure it out. And that's where foraging goes from just being like a quaint hobby to a type of urban political movement to reshape what it is and where we live on all of these different scales. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think it definitely answered the question. I think that's an amazing answer. I really like those. Yeah, that point. It is so interesting that it's another, like, I guess, facet of separation. I practice herbalism, and I've always been taught to, like, not harvest herbs on the side of the road, but some of the best herbs grow on the side of the road because they're actually adapted to this more sort of this like challenged ecosystem in a way, and also all the water runoff from the road. So, but yeah, I really like that point that you just made.
What are you harvesting that's best on the side of the road?
Well, a lot of yarrow grows on the side of the road. Yeah. Of course, fennel, which I know is, again, another like invasive species, but it's also really great to have around.
Yeah.
In New Mexico, where I was living before Los Angeles, there's a lot of cota, Navajo tea on the side of the road. And it just kind of looks like this little sprawly plant, but it's just such an amazing plant. What else? Oh, of course. And also in New Mexico, rabbit brush. It's very prolific on the side of the road. We use that for dyeing, though.
What were you doing with yarrow?
Yarrow's my favorite plant. So I do a lot of stuff with it in terms of, I use the flowers and the leaves for tea, to help promote, to help reduce cramps and period pains. But also just using the leaves for a wound is really incredible because it has a lot of potassium and vitamin K, so it stops bleeding like almost immediately. And then I also put it in salve. So many uses. And in terms of farming and permaculture practices, yarrow is also an amazing plant to have around because the leaves have so much nitrogen in them. So it's got that long taproot, so it pulls it up. And
then that taproot is like a great, it makes it pre-adapted to urban environments, the side of the road, because it can go into a crack and it can thrive in those spaces. That's great. I think, like the way you're talking about just like focusing on one plant like yarrow. So there's these, these long histories of that plant, in our use and are being co-shaped by it, how it helps us, on any number of levels, how it helps other plants and soil production, and I think that's where, to me, it gets really interesting in terms of something like native and invasive and this idea of nature and non-nature. Because here you're talking about a deep, probably at least a few thousand-year long plant-human coevolution. And in a loose sense, it's a kind of symbiotic relationship that also has like conceptual fallout, right? Like how metaphorical fallout. And I think that's really, the more we pay attention to those type of things, the more we can imagine, I would say, like a better way of entangling with our environment than where we see it as this kind of separate thing and that humans are inherently bad or the problem. And that our urban spaces are disasters. There's like you guys probably have a lot of knotweed out there as well.
Yeah, we do.
So like Japanese knotweed is another really fascinating plant. That in Great Britain, it's considered so dangerous. It's the same as like low-grade uranium, and it's like environmental hazard status, and it destroys property values. You can't move it off your property, to get rid of it. But at the same time, as people are imagining that, it's one of the best plants that goes into really damaged urban spaces. It will turn a parking lot. It'll break up a parking lot in one season. Mm-hmm. So, if you go to somewhere where there was an old drive-in mall, knotweed will have started to colonize it, and it's producing soil. It's breaking up that asphalt, and that's because it's also in a way pre-adapted. It co-evolved with lava fields in Japan, so it would be the first thing to grow after a lava flow. So it loves cities, just like people love cities. It loves cities, and it loves asphalt, and and so what it's doing is it's breaking up these things, and it's producing environments that then other species come into, and then there's this urban succession of species shaping something, and it's also long human entanglements of a lot of medicinal uses. It's delicious to eat in spring. I don't know if you eat knotweed.
I haven't.
It's really wonderful. I have a friend who started like a knotweed festival, to just promote that. It's also turns out, I don't know the exact medicinal parts, but the coronavirus, it does something to how that binds to your cells. It blocks it in some way. So if you look at herbal treatments and tinctures and teas, the roots used for that. And so we've been digging up a lot of it around here and making concentrates and giving it to friends, and sharing it to the community for people who have like early symptoms of COVID, especially in March when it was really big here.
Wow. Yeah, I was thinking about that actually as you were talking about even just sort of this terminology, these categories of invasive, non-invasive, because that's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, often the quote unquote invasive or the so-called invasive species are the ones who are responsible for actually creating or doing literally the groundbreaking work of an ecosystem. And in places where I've lived in a high desert basically my whole life, and so I'm kind of really familiar with these like super tough arid grounds, and those plants that live there are invasive species and in certain ecologies, but they're just such pioneers in a way, paving the way for other species to come in and thrive and live and help support the ecosystem. So
yeah, and I mean, they're a great example where you're seeing that rapid agency of like non-humans in our urban environment, where it's not really all about us. And I think, in us deciding what gets to be here and what doesn't, whether it's, illegal human aliens or supposedly illegal plant aliens. But these creatures are all, they're rapidly, dynamically changing urban spaces in profound and important ways, while we're considering them a problem. And I think, we're missing what the issue is, which is like, how do we create rich, dynamic ecosystems?
Yeah.
And I know in our area and this is another common criticism of, say, the native invasive paradigm, is that it leads to all the conservation energy, money, and resources going to removing things, but not actually building things.
Totally.
So how do we become, co-shapers rather than just removers?
Yeah, exactly. It's like the extractive process versus an additive process. when you create a healthy system, or just a system in general, like you're adding these additional sort of attributes to that, then it's creating it. Then it's, all those, all of those kind of like those toxins are cycling throughout the nutrient system, and they're sort of being digested and transformed in just this, in the inherent cycling of it, and not, rather than like removing something in terms of remediation or conservation.
Yeah, and like whole removing sequestering model, which doesn't really work.
No.
So you have to dump your pollution somewhere.
Exactly.
Versus either not having pollution and the bioremediation, phytoremediation. I mean, so that's the other wonderful thing all of these species in our novel ecosystems are doing, is they're really bioremediating and creating, I don't know, were there any other questions?
There aren't any in the chat. I'm wondering if Alvaro has any questions, actually, because he's looking into how we name things and the sort of the taxonomic processes that are fairly colonial, to say the least. And so I don't know if he has any questions, or if you have any thoughts about, Alvaro and I have been talking a lot about naming, the process of naming, and how it at once, like, it helps us facilitate, or it facilitates forming a relationship with a plant or with another species, because when you can sort of call it, you begin to understand it and form that relationship. But like, still the act of naming is such a human act. And so like, where do we lie on that? I guess, like, how do we land on that tension? And Alvaro's found some really interesting research about indigenous taxonomical systems. I don't feel like I could really speak to that. But yeah, do you have any, I guess that's a question that I can ask, or what are your thoughts about the act of naming?
I mean, I think, like, there's so many levels to that. I'd love to hear what Alvaro found on taxonomic systems. And I mean, just maybe a couple thoughts before hearing that. Like, the species model is really flawed in the sense that, like, where I was starting, humans aren't a single species. We're already in, an ecosystem, multiplicity. And, that multiplicity is more than just our bodies' multiplicity, but, we're deeply interdependent on, certain creatures we find in our environment. And, when we migrate, they all come with us. Some deliberately and most indirectly, right? And so I think there has to be a way of thinking of entanglements as the foundation, rather than the atomistic model of like species by species. But the entanglements should also involve things that normally we'd think of as non-living, like tools and objects and systems, and that other cosmologies, like animist cosmologies, so, First Nations cosmologies in North America, I think offer really interesting insights, because they start at a deep level with the assumption that everything is the same status as a human. They're like a type of human. They look different. So whether it's a rock or a bird. And I think without some model of agency like that, our anthropocentric models and our nature culture division models end up being really destructive. Alvaro.
Alvaro, I think you can come in if you mute your audio on the streaming portion. So I'll replay, or excuse me, I'll restate your question if you have one, or your thoughts, or Ian can. So the question was, just for the audience, Alvaro has worked in between sort of the art and science world, and stated that in the sciences he feels like it's sort of inherently anthropocentric. And so he asked Ian if there were ways of moving outside of that model, and if Ian thought that that was a possibility.
Yeah, that's a great question, Alvaro. I mean, the first thing I'd say is, like, we're always in more than one world or paradigm or framework, you know, and it's always more mixed up. And like the sciences in the plural are always way more complicated than they sort of state in their official communications with the world. And scientists are much more, you know, complex in their judgments too, I would say. You know, so there's one part is parsing that out. The other is, I'd say there's like a number of fields that have, you know, there's like in anthropology, even though anthropos is in the title, you know, there's been a real move to think of, you know, what is a non-human centered anthropology, people writing about, you know, trees, forests, how does a forest think, you know, non-human ways of being in the world. I think also, you know, there's parts of biology where we're looking at human and non-humans and how plants are used. So there's like a number of fields there that are already have moved in those directions and figures in it. But I think you bring a bigger question in my mind, is like, and that was sort of part of where I wanted to get in the discussion, which is where, you know, what happens if we put the entirety of our ontology up for grabs? You know, if we don't think of the kind of nature culture model we have as the final say, or the deepest way to understand the world, and we were to just put it beside other modes of being alive, like say animism or totemism or whatever, and imagine that they're equally valid accesses to reality, and that offer entirely different entanglements. Because I think, you know, for example, like an animist perspective where you say, you know, a tree, a plant, and a rock are also people, that changes everything. And so, you know, I wonder if we can't, you know, start to speculate about new cosmologies and ontologies that take, that ground themselves in that these alternatives are actually offer or something really profound that we couldn't get to with a kind of our current model. So, and I mean, that's sort of, you see that in all sorts of more speculative practices. But you see that in, like, I've really seen that in the revival, of First Nations practices, languages. Australia is a really great example to look at, where they're the longest single culture in one place. So they've been co-shaping, the First Nations people of Australia have been co-shaping Australia for 67,000 years. What does that mean? And what is that as a worldview, as a cosmology? And could that be a better place to start thinking about these questions?
Wow. I think that's a really good thought to end on. And yeah, will leave us, hopefully, that will percolate through all of those who are watching out there, and also to everyone that's going to watch this in the future. Do you have any closing thoughts, Ian?
Yeah, I would like, maybe, just as closing, just recommend, like, on the last thought about Australia, there's a great book by Bruce Pascoe called Dark Emu, which is a I think a really powerful book. There's a great book on co-shaping systems in California called Tending the Wild, which looks at First Nations practices, thousands of years in California. And then I would just recommend people get good foraging guides. I don't know the right ones for the West Coast, but by us, there's one by Peter Del Tredici called Wild Urban Plants of the Northeast. And I think if people are really interested in the science part, looking at novel ecosystems is the large kind of framework that's is evolving outside of the traditional ideas of native invasive and those models of thinking about ecosystems. And I think the last thing to say is to adopt a kind of commons perspective, which is that the political part to me, where once we start to see that there's an eco-political ramifications of foraging, and you're asking questions like the audience did, like, is it safe to eat this? Is it poison? To start a work to build a community from the ground up around that in your neighborhood, to sort of take a multi-species ownership of where you live. And the dependency part, I think, is really important. Like Caitlin, where you're talking about foraging for medicinals. So like your literal health is connected to the health of the place you live. In the case where I'm saying more like your nutritional health is still also connected to foraging, but you move from imagining elsewhere to imagining start under your feet, collaborating with other species and your community.
Thank you so much. This has made my day.
Thank you, Alvaro and Caitlin, and everybody out there. It's really wonderful to be part of this.
It's really wonderful to have you a part of this. Thank you so much, Ian.
Okay, take care.
Bye.